The wind cut through Ash Creek that evening, dry, sharp, and full of dust. Somewhere beyond the stalls, a loose shutter banged against a saloon wall, the sound hollow like a half-spoken regret. Under the fading light, she stood on a wooden crate, hands bound, chin steady, eyes dry as the desert. They called her a thief, a liar, a girl not worth a dime. And yet, the crowd still came, drawn by cruelty the way moths chase fire. A man watched from the edge, broad shoulders, worn hat pulled low. He didn't speak when they mocked her, didn't flinch when they raised the price. But when the auctioneer laughed, he stepped forward. $1 silver hit the dust between them. His voice was quiet. Not to buy, he said, to set her free. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. She looked at him, disbelief flickering behind the dirt and shame. Then she whispered soft, cracked, almost trembling, "You'll regret choosing me." The rancher smiled, a tired smile that knew loss too well. "I already regret waiting this long." The wind moved again, carrying their words into the open country, and that was where their story began, not with love, but with the small mercy of a man who refused to walk away. And if stories like this still stir something quiet in you, stay a while longer and hit subscribe so you won't miss the next time we return to tell one more. The evening light in Ash Creek bled slow and copper, the kind that turned dust into fire. Wind moved lazy through the market street, dragging scraps of paper and old laughter across the boards. Somewhere, a horse snorted tired, restless, its reins tied to a post that had seen too many summers. The air carried the dry smell of sweat and sunburnt rope. It was the last Sunday of summer, 1879. People had gathered near the well, forming a loose circle. Men in hats leaned on railings, boots coated with dirt, their spurs clicking against wood like ticking clocks. Women whispered behind gloved hands. A boy balanced on a barrel to see better. Someone was selling something, or someone. She stood on a crate at the center, wrists bound with coarse hemp. Her dress was torn at the hem, one shoe missing a lace, but her back stayed straight, and her chin didn't bend. The wind caught a strand of her dark hair, lifting it for a heartbeat before letting it fall again. No tears, no plea, just the dry calm of someone who'd already survived too much to beg anymore. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the stillness. $2 for the girl, strong arms, no husband, no family. He laughed at his own cruelty, and the crowd laughed with him. Nora, Leigh Whitcomb, though no one here cared for the name, kept her eyes on the horizon beyond the rooftops. Somewhere past those hills lay the sound of water, maybe the smell of pine, maybe a place that didn't look at her like this. A bottle shattered near the trough. Someone cheered. A man tossed a coin, missed, and shrugged. The sound of metal hitting dirt felt louder than the laughter. She flinched just once, not from fear, but from memory. At the edge of the crowd stood a man who didn't join in. He was taller than most, shoulders broad beneath a dust-darkened shirt. A blacksmith's apron hung folded over his arm, and his hands were rough with old burns. Amos McKenna watched without a word. There was something about the stillness in him, like a hammer resting before the next strike. When the auctioneer raised his arm again, Nora shifted her weight, trying to stay balanced. Her wrists ached. The rope had already cut into skin. Someone called out. $1 mocking laughter followed. $50 and a drink another yelled. The auctioneer grinned, wiping his mouth with a red kerchief. She stared at the faces, dust, smoke, whiskey, and felt the old truth settle in. People didn't buy flesh because they needed it. They bought power, and she was tired of being someone's proof of power. Then, the crowd parted slightly, bootsteps slow, measured. A man moved forward, hat low, eyes shadowed by the brim, the blacksmith. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single silver coin, bright against the grime. It hit the dust with a soft, solid sound. $1, he said. The auctioneer grinned wider. Sold then to the gentleman in the leather boots. The man didn't smile. He stepped closer, lifted the rope from her wrists, slow and careful. When the last knot loosened, he spoke, his voice steady as rain. Not to buy, he said, to set her free. The laughter thinned for a breath. Even the wind went still. Nora looked up, confusion flickering behind the calm. Freedom was a word she hadn't trusted in a long time. Her voice came out raw, half whisper, half disbelief. "You'll regret choosing me." The man's eyes softened beneath the brim. "I already regret waiting this long." He turned, motioned for her to step down. She hesitated. Her legs felt heavy, her hands lighter than they should. When her feet touched the ground, the crate creaked behind her, like the end of something old. The crowd began to scatter, disappointed that Mercy made such poor entertainment. A few muttered, one spat near her boot, but no one followed. They walked away from the square in silence. The sun was sinking now, painting the storefronts in tired gold. Each step stirred a little more dust into the air, until the town looked like it was vanishing behind them. Nora kept a few paces back. She didn't know where he was taking her, and she wasn't sure she cared. Freedom, even borrowed, was still air in the lungs. Her wrists throbbed where the rope had been. She rubbed the marks gently, like touching a memory. The blacksmith stopped near the hitching post, untying a chestnut mare. "Name's Amos McKenna," he said without looking at her. He placed a hand on the saddle horn, as if the horse were listening too. "You've got no reason to trust me. I know that." Nora said nothing. Her voice had always been the first thing men took from her. Silence was safer. He glanced at her once more, then mounted. "If you've nowhere to go, my ranch has got an empty room. If you do have somewhere, I'll see you to the road." She didn't move. The market noise had faded behind them, replaced by the creak of the sign swinging above the general store and the faraway cry of a hawk. For the first time in years, no one was telling her what to do. The man waited, patient as stone. Finally, she took a step toward the horse. One step, then another. He nodded once, a gesture small enough to go unnoticed by the world. And that was how it began, not with love, nor with trust, but with a quiet that felt almost like peace. Behind them, the wind swept through Ash Creek again, scattering the dust, erasing footprints. Somewhere, a shutter banged against a wall. Somewhere, the crate she'd stood on toppled and broke. And in the space between that breaking sound and the hush that followed, a new story began to breathe softly, carefully, like a wounded thing learning it might live after all. The dust hadn't settled yet. It clung to the hem of her skirt, to the rope burns on her wrists, to the quiet between them. The sun was leaning low behind the roofs of Ash Creek, casting long stripes of gold and shadow across the ground. Somewhere behind, the market was still breathing, boots shuffling, voices fading, a piano starting up inside the saloon like nothing had happened at all. Nora didn't look back. Amos didn't speak. They moved through the narrow street, the sound of their steps slow and uneven, his steady, hers unsure. The mare waited near the water trough, flicking her tail against the flies. He brushed a hand over the horse's mane, like grounding himself after a long silence. Then, softly almost to the dust, he said, "You can ride, if you'd rather not walk." His voice was low, rough from years of smoke and iron. She hesitated. The thought of sharing a saddle, of being close to anyone again, made her chest tighten. "I'll walk," she murmured. He nodded, not pressing. Just checked the cinch strap, then led the horse by the reins as they headed out of town. For a while, there was nothing but the rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind sliding through the grass. The fields stretched wide on both sides, dry and endless, broken only by the rusted fence lines and a few sagging posts. Ash Creek fell away behind them, like a memory that had already begun to fade. She touched her wrists where the rope had bitten deep, tracing the grooves. The skin was raw, but the pain felt distant, dulled by the strange quiet around this man. He didn't look at her like the others had, didn't fill the air with questions or pity, just walked, head slightly bowed, as if carrying a silence of his own. The road curved toward the river, where a stand of cottonwoods caught the last light. He stopped there, let the mare drink, then bent to fill a tin cup with water. When he handed it to her, his hands were steady, his gaze somewhere far beyond her shoulder. She drank slowly. The water was cool, clean, real. It tasted of everything she'd been denied for too long. When she gave the cup back, she finally spoke, not to thank him, but to warn him, her voice quiet, almost breaking. "You'll regret choosing me." The words hung between them, fragile as smoke. Amos didn't answer right away. He crouched by the horse, adjusting the strap again, dust rising around his boots. Then he looked up, the sunset burning in his eyes. "I already regret waiting this long." It wasn't a line meant to comfort. It was truth heavy, worn, and simple. And it made her heart stutter, because no one had ever said anything like that before. He stood, tying the cup back to the saddle, then started walking again. She followed, her steps slower this time, each one heavier with thoughts she didn't want to think. They passed a stretch of fence half broken, where wild sunflowers pushed through the cracks. A hawk cried overhead, circling once before gliding into the orange light. The smell of sage drifted on the wind, faint and clean. Something loosened in her chest, just a little. She found herself glancing at him, noticing the way his shirt clung to his shoulders, the faint scar at his jaw, the quiet rhythm in his movements. He wasn't a man trying to impress. He was a man who'd already seen enough to stop pretending. After a while, she asked, "Why'd you do it?" Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, small but steady. He didn't stop walking, didn't sit right. He said, "Some things you can't let pass." The simplicity of it stung worse than any pity would have. She looked away, watching the dust rise and settle again. They reached the old bridge before night came fully down. The boards creaked beneath the horse's weight. Water murmured below, shallow from the summer heat. On the far side, the land opened again, miles of open country, quiet as prayer. Amos pointed to a cluster of lights far in the distance. "There's a place up ahead halfway to my ranch, an old station house. We'll stop there tonight." She nodded, though the idea of sleeping anywhere still felt foreign. By the time they reached the station, the moon had risen a thin white scar across the sky. The building leaned slightly, its paint long gone, the porch steps uneven, but there was a roof and 4 walls, and that was more than she'd had yesterday. Amos led the horse to the small corral out back, unbuckled the saddle, then returned with a small oil lantern. Inside, the air smelled of wood dust and thyme. He set the lantern on the table, light flickering across his face. "You can take the cot," he said quietly. "I'll keep to the chair." She shook her head. "I'll sit by the door." He studied her for a moment, then simply nodded. There was no arguing with a person who still needed to feel the wall behind them. The silence between them stretched not sharp, but heavy in its own way. He poured water into a basin, set it by her side. "Soap's on the shelf," he murmured. "Didn't know what else you'd need." Her fingers brushed the tin, and she almost whispered thank you, but stopped herself. Instead, she washed her wrists, the water turning faintly pink in the dim light. She stared at the small circles of blood fading away. Outside, the night had settled deep and cool. An owl called from the cottonwoods. The lantern flame danced, painting shadows on the walls like ghosts of old lives. Amos leaned back in the chair, one arm over the backrest, eyes half closed but not asleep. Nora watched the way the light touched his face, hard edges softened by fatigue. He looked like a man who'd built his life from silence and iron, and maybe that's why she trusted him. Just a little. She lay down on the cot, the rough blanket scratching against her skin. For the first time in months, no one was standing guard over her. The quiet felt strange, almost frightening in its gentleness. She turned her head toward him. He was still awake, eyes open now, meeting hers across the flickering light. No words, no promises, just a nod, barely there. She nodded back. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the door. The old hinges groaned, then fell silent again. Nora closed her eyes, and for a moment before sleep found her, she could almost believe the rope had never touched her skin. Somewhere in the dark, a coin gleamed faintly on the table the same silver dollar that had bought her nothing and everything. Morning came slow and pale, the kind that doesn't burn the cold away right off. A thin mist hung over the grass when they set out, and the world seemed made of breath and silence. Nora walked beside the horse while Amos rode easy, hat pulled low, his coat collar turned up against the chill. Neither spoke much. There was a quiet between them that wasn't empty, just waiting. The road east of Ash Creek wound through low ridges the color of rust. The land shifted there, less gentle, more bone than soil. A hawk drifted overhead, its shadow sliding over the ground like a dark hand. Every mile they left behind the town, the air felt a little cleaner, but the past has a way of walking faster than the wind. They reached Red Willow by midday. The canyon split the world open, a narrow cut of red rock and pale sand. Down below, a dry creek bed snaked between cliffs that looked almost alive in the light, breathing heat and silence. The horse's hooves echoed against stone, each step sounding too loud. Amos rode ahead, eyes scanning the ridgeline. He'd been through this pass 100 times before, hauling iron from the foundry, delivering tools to ranches farther south. But this time, he felt watched. Nora sensed it too. Her steps slowed. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, just something heavy moving inside her chest. The red rock walls seemed closer now, like the canyon was listening. Then came the sound hooves on stone, faint but certain. Amos stopped. The mare flicked her ears. 3 riders came out from behind a bend, dust swirling around them. Their coats were worn, guns low on their hips, faces shadowed under wide hats. Nora knew them before they even spoke. A breath caught in her throat. The one in front grinned thin, sharp, and cruelly familiar. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. "Didn't think I'd see you walking free, girl." Nora didn't move. The air around her went still, tight, her fingers clenched against her sleeve. Amos looked from her to the men, and the story wrote itself on his face without needing words. He slid off the horse. The sound of his boots hitting the ground was quiet, measured. His hand rested near the holster, but didn't draw. "She's with me," he said. The man laughed. "With you? That right, you know what she is." The others chuckled low, the kind of sound that had weight to it. Mean weight. Amos didn't flinch. "I know enough," he said. "And I said, she's with me." The man's smile faded a little. He shifted in the saddle, eyes narrowing. "You best step aside, Smith." "Ain't your business?" Amos didn't move. He stood square in the middle of the trail, one hand still resting easy near his gun, the other hanging loose by his side. The wind tugged at his coat, the sun catching on the edge of his belt buckle. "She goes where I go," he said quietly, "and no man lays a hand on her." For a long second, no one spoke. A crow called somewhere up the canyon, the sound echoing between the rocks. The man in front spat into the dust, then leaned back in his saddle. "Well, hell," he said finally. Didn't figure the blacksmith had a taste for charity. He turned his horse a little, enough that the barrel of his rifle glinted in the light. "Just remember, folks around here don't forget easy, nor forgive." Amos's voice stayed calm. "Then you'll remember me too." They stared at each other, long enough for the air itself to feel brittle. Then the man laughed, short and hard. "Let's go. Boys." The 3 turned their horses, spurs jingling. As they rode off, the dust rose behind them, curling like smoke. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Amos let out a breath slow through his teeth. Nora hadn't moved. Her face was pale, eyes fixed on the ground. He turned to her, voice gentler now. "You know them?" She nodded once. "Used to," she said. That was all. He didn't press, just touched the mare's neck, the gesture soft and grounding. "Let's keep moving." They walked in silence through the rest of Red Willow. The light shifted redder as the day fell toward evening. Somewhere high above, clouds were gathering, small and gray at first. Nora's hands shook, though she tried to hide it. Every echo of a hoof, every shadow on the ridge felt like the past waiting to drag her back. But Amos stayed close, never looking away from the trail, never rushing her. By the time they reached the far side of the canyon, the sky had turned the color of old copper. The first drops of rain hit the dust slow, scattered, like the land itself was sighing. They found shelter under an overhang of stone. Amos gathered a few dry branches, struck a match. The fire caught slow, the flame flickering in the wind before settling into a steady glow. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, face lit by the orange light. She watched him a long while before speaking. "They knew me," she said quietly. "Knew what I did, what I was." He looked up, and her voice cracked, the words small. "Aren't you going to ask?" He shook his head. "You'll tell me when you want to." The rain picked up, soft but steady, tapping against the rock. The firelight trembled across the canyon wall. She stared into the flame until her eyes stung. All her life, men had wanted her story before they decided what she was worth. This one didn't, and that more than the dollar, more than the rope gone from her wrists, felt like the first real freedom she'd known. Amos fed another stick to the fire. "Get some rest," he said. "We've got miles to cover, come sunrise." She nodded, drawing her knees close, the warmth of the flame brushing her face. Outside, the rain deepened, washing the dust from the trail, the blood from her memory. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Somewhere beyond the canyon, thunder rolled low, distant, uncertain, like something stirring that had been quiet too long. Nora lifted her eyes once more to the man across the fire. He wasn't looking at her, but the steadiness in him was something she could lean on, even from afar. She lay down, turned her face toward the faint light, and closed her eyes. The storm moved closer, slow and sure. And when she finally drifted into sleep, it wasn't fear that followed her into the dark. It was the echo of his voice in the canyon air, steady and certain. "She goes where I go." By the time they reached the hills, the rain had thinned to mist. The world was gray and clean, as if the storm had washed the dust from the bones of the land. The road curved gently upward, between slopes freckled with sage and dry grass bending under the wind. Ahead, the shape of the ranch rose timbers dark with age, a roof patched in tin, smoke curling slow from a stovepipe. Amos slowed his horse to a walk. The mare's hooves made soft sounds in the damp earth, a rhythm steady enough to calm the ache in the air. Nora walked beside him, quiet, her shawl pulled tight, eyes tracing the fence lines that reached like tired arms across the field. It wasn't much of a place, but it stood firm against the weather like it had made peace with the years, not fought them. A windmill creaked near the barn, turning slow. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then stopped, as if it, too, were thinking. Amos dismounted, tying the reins to the post. He opened the gate and held it for her without a word. The hinges groaned, metal against metal, then fell still again. She stepped through. The ground smelled of hay and rain, of old wood soaked in life. Inside the main house, the light was soft and golden. A wood stove crackled faintly. The air carried the scent of coffee grounds and iron. He took off his hat, set it on a peg by the door. "This is McKenna Range," he said. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "It's not much, but it holds steady." She looked around, her gaze catching on the little things: a coat thrown over a chair, a row of tools polished from use, a lantern half full of oil. Every object seemed to have a story. It wasn't in a hurry to tell. He gestured toward a narrow hallway. "Room's down there," he said. "Locks on the inside." He paused a moment, chose it that way. She met his eyes briefly, then nodded. The words caught somewhere between gratitude and caution. "Thank you." He only tipped his head, like that was all either of them needed to say. The room was small, a cot, a wooden chest, a single window that looked toward the western ridge. When she set her bag down, just a bundle of cloth. Really, it made almost no sound. Through the window, The sun was slipping behind the hills, leaving a trail of red that bled into violet. She stood there a long while, watching the light fade until the shadows took the shape of old memories. Then she closed the door, turned the lock once, twice. The click echoed soft and final. Outside, the floorboards creaked under Amos's steps. He didn't knock, didn't speak. When the house fell still again, she opened the door just a little and found it there folded neatly on the porch rail, a wool blanket and a tin cup filled with water. No note, no gesture demanding thanks. She touched the blanket. It was warm from his hands. For a moment, she just stood there, the night air cool against her face. The moon had risen thin, sharp, and watchful. Somewhere out in the field, a horse snorted softly. She pulled the blanket close, sat by the window, and let her thoughts wander like the wind outside. It had been years since she'd slept behind a locked door, years since anyone had left something by her side without expecting payment or pity. Down the hall, the floor creaked again. She could picture him there, in that chair by the stove, boots crossed at the ankle, hat tilted forward, pretending not to listen for the sound of her moving. He was a quiet man, but quiet didn't mean empty. There was weight in his silences, the kind that made her wonder what ghosts kept him company when the nights stretched long. The fire in the stove popped once, sharp and brief. Nora flinched before she could stop herself. Her breath hitched, hand gripping the edge of the blanket. The sound had dragged something from deep inside, something that remembered ropes, shouting, the sting of dust and fear. It passed, but not fully. She stayed still, waiting for her heartbeat to settle. Then she noticed its soft footsteps, coming closer, not hurried, just steady. A pause outside her door. No knock, no words. Then the faint sound of boots turning away, the creak of the floor fading back toward the stove. And somehow, that quiet his decision to stay outside, it soothed more than any comfort could have. She whispered, without meaning to, "Don't be kind. Amos, kindness doesn't last." The words floated into the dark, unheard, or maybe not. Outside, wind moved through the grass, brushing against the house like a hand over old scars. Hours passed. The lamp burned low. The fire turned to embers. Sleep came slow and restless, full of half-remembered faces. When dawn broke, the light crept in thin and pale, laying soft across the floorboards. She woke to find a tin plate on the table by the door, cornbread, still warm, wrapped in cloth. The blanket was gone, folded neatly over the chair outside. He'd risen before sunrise. She could hear the hammer's faint ring from the forge behind the barn, steady, rhythmic, the sound of someone who didn't need words to explain who they were. She sat by the window again, breaking the cornbread piece by a piece, watching the light stretch across the hills. The world outside was wide, untamed, and for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like a cage. The smell of smoke drifted in, carrying the warmth of iron and morning air. She closed her eyes, and somewhere, deep in that quiet house between two hills, something shifted not loud enough to name, just the faint hum of a life starting to breathe again. The mornings at McKenna Range came quiet. No church bells, no town bustle, just the slow waking of the land itself, wine brushing through dry grass, the faint rattle of the water pump, and the crack of a match catching the stove's first flame. The world here didn't rush. It breathed. Nora woke to the smell of wood smoke and warm cornmeal. The light slipping through the window was soft, almost shy. On the table beside the door sat a tin basin filled with warm water, steam curling faintly in the cool air, and beside it, half a loaf of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Nothing else? No note? She sat up slow, still not used to softness that asked for nothing in return. Her fingers brushed the rim of the basin, the warmth catching her off guard. He must have heated it before dawn. For a long time, she just sat there, listening to the sound of the forge outside the measured ring of hammer on metal, each strike like a heartbeat in the morning stillness. It was strange how steady that sound felt. How alive. She washed her hands, the water turning faintly gray with dust. The simple act of cleaning off the road's weight made her throat tighten. Freedom wasn't loud. It was a quiet thing, small, almost invisible, like a basin of warm water waiting by a door. When she stepped outside, Amos was already at work near the forge. The sun had climbed halfway over the hills, painting the valley gold. He was bent over the anvil, sleeves rolled, each movement practiced, patient. Sparks lifted from the metal like tiny stars. He looked up once, nodded to her, and went back to work. No words, no questions, just that small nod, as if saying you're seen, but you don't owe me a thing. She found herself standing there longer than she meant to, arms folded against the chill. The rhythm of his work, the scrape, the strike, the hiss of water when hot iron met the trough felt like something older than either of them. She turned away finally, walking toward the small vegetable patch near the fence. The soil was cracked but not dead. A few shoots of green pushed through, stubborn and brave. She knelt and brushed the dirt gently from a wilted stalk, not knowing why, only that it felt right to do something with her hands. Time stretched quiet. Somewhere, a hawk called over the ridge. The wind tugged at her shawl. By midday, she'd filled a small pail with weeds and found herself humming, without meaning to a tune she half remembered from long ago. It startled her. Sound had been something she'd hidden behind for too long. When she looked up, Amos was standing by the fence, a mug of coffee in his hand. He didn't smile exactly, but his eyes softened. "Good soil," he said simply. "Just needed a bit of tending." She nodded, unsure if he meant the ground or her. He set the mug on a post and walked back toward the barn. The conversation ended the way all their exchanges did, quietly, without an edge. And yet, somehow, it carried more weight than most words ever had. That evening, when the sun began to fall behind the western hills, she sat by the window with a small notebook in her lap. It was worn, edges frayed. She hadn't written in it since before Ash Creek. The first page was smudged, the ink from another life. She turned to a clean one and wrote, slowly, as if testing each letter. "He lets me breathe. He doesn't ask who I was. He only leaves space for who I might be." The pencil trembled a little in her hand. She closed the book before she could think better of it. Outside, the windmill creaked softly. The dog barked once, then went still. The world had a rhythm here, unhurried, forgiving. Amos came in after dark, carrying the smell of forge smoke and rain. He left his boots by the door, washed his hands in the basin she'd refilled, and nodded toward the kettle warming on the stove. "Smells like you found the coffee tin," he said. She smiled faintly. "Didn't know if it was yours." He poured a cup, handed it to her. "It's for whoever needs it most." They sat by the table, not facing each other exactly, just sharing the same air, the same small sound of spoons tapping tin. The silence between them was no longer sharp. It had softened, like wood worn smooth from use. He spoke once more, his voice quiet, eyes still on the cup. "Some things don't need fixing. Just time." She looked at him, wanting to answer, but the words stayed inside. Instead, she nodded once. That seemed to be enough. Later that night, after he'd gone to the barn, she opened her notebook again. The fire burned low, light flickering across the page. She added one more line beneath the others. "Sometimes kindness doesn't speak, it just waits." She closed the book and blew out the lamp. The room fell into darkness, except for the faint orange glow of embers dying slow in the stove. She lay awake, listening to the night sounds, the creak of timbers, the sigh of wind brushing against the shutters, the distant rhythm of the hammer, even now, steady, patient, unyielding. It felt like the sound of safety. And before sleep took her, she whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." The house didn't answer, but somewhere beyond the walls, a coyote called once, long and low, a lonely sound. Yes, but not empty. The rain came slow that morning, soft at first, then steady enough to blur the hills into shapes of gray and blue. The sound of it on the roof was gentle, almost like a lullaby. Nora stood by the window, watching the drops slide down the glass in crooked lines. The fields beyond were washed clean mud rising in the furrows, the world smelling of earth and wet wood. Inside the house, everything was still. The kettle hummed low on the stove. The dog had taken shelter under the porch, and somewhere out back, the steady rhythm of Amos's hammer had fallen silent. She listened for it a while, the way you listen for something that makes you feel safe without knowing why. When it didn't return, she wondered where he'd gone. The day passed quiet. She mended one of the curtains that had torn in the wind, boiled a little stew, read through an old book she'd found tucked behind a shelf somebody's Bible, pages worn soft, names written in pencil along the back cover. She didn't know who they were, but the faded handwriting made her ache anyway. Toward evening, the rain eased. The sky stayed heavy, a soft, bruised purple. She stepped out onto the porch, breathing the scent of wet pine and smoke. The boards creaked beneath her bare feet, cool against her skin. That's when she saw it. On the top step, where the rain still dripped from the eaves, lay a single white columbine, its petals wet, its stem wrapped with a thin strand of twine. A mountain flower, rare this far down the valley. She froze. The kind of stillness that isn't fear, but something gentler, something that doesn't know how to receive kindness without suspecting the cost. She looked around. The yard was empty. The forge was dark. The horse corral quiet. He'd gone, probably back toward the lower fields before the night set in. She bent down, fingers brushing the delicate petals. They trembled slightly under her touch. A flower like that didn't belong to the world she'd known, where gifts were traded for something. And beauty was a trap, dressed in silk and promises. But this was just a thing left quietly on a step, asking for nothing. She carried it inside and set it on the table in a glass jar. The flower leaned slightly, soft against the rim, its reflection trembling in the lantern light. She found herself staring at it longer than she meant to, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, stillness without dread. The rain began again outside, harder now, drumming steady against the roof. She moved through the house, checking the windows, tightening the latch near her bed. Her hand went automatically to the chair by the door, the one she always wedged beneath the handle before sleeping. It was a habit carved deep, the kind that keeps you alive long after the danger's gone. She stood there for a while, hand on the chair back. The wind howled faintly through the eaves. The flower on the table caught a flicker of firelight, and for a second it seemed to glow. Something small in her gave way. She stepped back, slowly, and left the chair where it was. The door stayed unlocked. When she finally lay down, the sound of rain filled the space where fear used to live. It wasn't comfort yet, but it wasn't terror either. It was something in between, soft, uncertain, but real. Outside, the storm carried on. Thunder rolled far away over the ridges. The columbine's petals quivered each time the wind pressed against the house. But it didn't fall. She woke once in the night. The lamp had burned out, and the room was full of the silver light that comes only after rain. She could hear him outside, the faint sound of boots on the porch, a horse snorting quietly, then the hinge of the gate closing. He hadn't come to speak, just making sure things were right. Maybe. She almost called out, almost said thank you, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she listened until the sound of his steps faded into the night. The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds like forgiveness. The hills shimmered with dew. The dog barked once, joy in his voice this time. She found another small thing by the porch rail, a tin cup turned upside down to keep the flower from the rain. He'd thought to protect it. She smiled without meaning to. Later, when she sat at the table with her notebook, she opened to the page she'd written days ago. Beneath her old lines, he lets me breathe. He doesn't ask who I was. He only leaves space for who I might be. She added one more. Today, he left a wildflower. Maybe he doesn't know what it means. Maybe he does. She closed the notebook gently, the pencil resting between the pages like a secret. Outside. Amos was back at the forge. The hammer's ring was slower today, softer, like the metal itself was listening. Nora stood by the window a long time, watching him work his shoulders steady, his face calm in the firelight. Something in her chest eased again, quietly, like a door that hadn't opened in years finding its hinge. That night, when she went to bed, she left the door unbarred. The chair stayed by the wall. The wildflower, though wilted at the edges, still stood in the glass beside her window. The moon hung low over the hills, pale as milk. Wind whispered through the cracks in the boards, carrying the smell of rain and iron. She turned her face toward the light, eyes half closed, and whispered not to him, not to anyone, maybe just to the dark itself. This house doesn't hold me. It holds me safe. And somewhere outside, almost carried away by the wind, came the faint sound of his hammer, again 3 soft strikes, a pause, and the quiet echo of something changing, slowly, beautifully, for good. The wind shifted that morning, hot, dry, and bitter with the smell of dust and iron. By noon, clouds of gray hung low over the ridge, and the air carried the faint echo of hammer strikes from miles away. Amos hitched the wagon, tightened the straps, and said, quietly, "We'll go to Gray Butte today. Need feed and salt. You could use a few things, too." Nora didn't answer at first. She looked down at her hands, the faint pink stains of the wildflower still clinging to her skin from days before. Gray Butte was only 12 miles east, but it might as well have been another lifetime back toward the noise, the stares, the words that still bruised when remembered. Still? She nodded. All right. They left before the sun reached its height. The road was narrow, carved through rock and willow, and the air smelled faintly of smoke from the mine camps ahead. Amos sat steady on the seat, reins loose in his hands, hat low against the wind. Nora kept her eyes on the trail, the world passing slow around them. Gray Butte appeared by mid-afternoon, rows of shacks and low buildings. A saloon sign creaking in the wind, the ground slick with red clay. Men moved between the mines and the bar, faces coated in coal dust, eyes hollow from long days underground. The wind there was strange, sharp, metallic, as if it carried the ghosts of things buried too deep. They stopped outside the general store. Nora stepped down first, her boots sinking into the wet earth. The air was thick with whiskey and sweat, and the restless noise of a town living too fast. Inside, the bell over the door gave a small, tired jingle. The room smelled of kerosene and coffee beans. Amos went straight to the counter, his list in hand, while Nora wandered toward the shelves, quiet, careful, eyes down. She picked up a spool of thread, a bar of soap, a length of ribbon the color of storm clouds. Nothing fancy, just things that made a place feel less like survival and more like living. But the noise behind her started small, a chuckle, a whisper, then another. "Hey now," a voice said. "Ain't that her? The one from Ash Creek?" Another joined in. "Heard she went for $1. Guess that's what she's worth." Nora froze. The words hit like stones, soft and familiar in their cruelty. She set the ribbon back on the shelf, fingers trembling. The laughter grew louder. Someone spat on the floor. "Hey, sweetheart," the first voice called again. "How's freedom treating you? You sellin' or just tagging along this time?" Amos turned then, slow, like a storm deciding whether to break. He crossed the room in 3 long steps. The men near the back leaned against the counter, grinning. One of them, a tall drunk with a torn vest, raised his glass toward Nora. "Don't look so scared, darling," he said. "We're just saying hello." The sound that came next wasn't loud, just the solid, heavy thud of Amos's fist meeting bone. The man's body hit the floor before his drink did. The room went still. You could hear the creak of the lantern chain, the drop of whiskey spilling onto the boards. Amos stood over him, chest rising slow, hands still curled tight. Then his voice came, low but carrying clear through the quiet. "You touch her," he said, "or even breathe her name again, and you deal with me." The drunk groaned, clutching his jaw. No one moved. The storekeeper swallowed hard, eyes darting between them. But Amos just turned to Nora, his expression softening as if nothing had happened. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded, though her throat wouldn't let sound out. They left the store with the same quiet they had entered, only now the street seemed to listen. The wind kicked up, swirling dust around their boots. Nora kept her head down, her pulse loud in her ears. When they reached the wagon, Amos loaded the supplies without a word. She climbed up beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. Halfway down the road out of town, he spoke, his voice steady but low. "Don't let them take what you already earned back." She looked at him, unsure. He met her eyes briefly. Freedom. They don't get to stain that too. She wanted to answer, wanted to say how the words still found the cracks in her armor, how even the memory of laughter could pull her back to the rope and the dust. But the way he said it, quiet, final, made her believe maybe it didn't have to stay that way forever. The rest of the ride home passed in silence. The wind softened as the town faded behind them. The air smelled of sage again, clean, untainted. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had slipped low, and a thin chill had crept into the valley. Amos led the horse to the barn, gave her a brief nod, then disappeared toward the forge. No lecture, no questions. Nora went inside. The house was dark except for the glow of the lantern on the table, and there set right in its light was a small plate covered by a clean cloth. She lifted the edge, a round loaf of cornbread, sweetened with honey, and beside it, another white columbine, its petals fresh, its stem wrapped in a single thread of twine. Her breath caught. She hadn't heard him come in, hadn't seen him set it down. The house was still. Only the wind moved, whispering against the shutters like a lullaby trying to find its way inside. She sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the simple gift before her. The bread, the flour, the quiet that came with both. No pity in them, no payment asked, just kindness wordless, steady, and undeserved. Her throat burned. She pressed a hand to her mouth, the tears coming silent, clean, unstoppable. No one had ever fought for her without wanting something in return. No one had ever left her something beautiful just because she existed to see it. She stayed there for a long while, listening to the wind move through the valley, the soft rhythm of the hammer echoing far in the dark. And for the first time, she let herself cry, not from fear, not from shame, but from the small, bewildering mercy of being seen as a person again. When the tears finally slowed, she reached for the flower, held it against her heart, and whispered, "Thank you." Amos. Outside, the wind shifted again, no longer bitter, but carrying the clean scent of rain and coal dust, washed away. Night came slow, dragging its shadows across the valley until the hills disappeared into one long, dark breath. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the earth damp and quiet. Only the windmill turned now and then, groaning softly, the sound of something too stubborn to rest. Inside the house, the lantern burned low. Nora sat by the table, a single candle flickering near her notebook. The flower Amos had given her had withered, but she hadn't thrown it away. Its pale petals had turned thin as paper, fragile but still whole, like something that refused to vanish. She closed the notebook. The thought had been circling her mind for days, quiet but relentless. Pascal Rourke, the man who'd sold her, who'd taken her sister, and left her in the dust. The past wasn't sleeping. It was calling. She rose without a sound, pulled on her coat, and slipped her notebook into the pocket. The boards under her feet creaked softly as if asking her not to go. She glanced toward the door to Amos's room. No light beneath it. He'd be asleep by now, or pretending to be. The sky outside was bruised purple, heavy with stars. She saddled the smaller mare, careful not to wake the dog or the rooster. When she mounted, the leather groaned, and she froze listening. Nothing stirred. Then she rode out, quiet and steady, her heart pounding in her throat. The town was 7 miles away, and the road there was nothing but dust and memory. Each hoofbeat felt like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Ash Creek slept as she arrived. A few windows still glowed gamblers and drunks who didn't know the meaning of rest. She tied the horse behind the livery and pulled her hat low. The courthouse sat at the far end of Main Street, brick red against the starlight, the flag hanging limp in the still air. She slipped through the side gate, boots sinking into the damp earth, and made her way to the records office. The window latch was old. A knife tip and a steady hand were enough. It clicked open with a soft sigh. Inside, the room smelled of dust, paper, and lamp oil. Rows of shelves leaned under the weight of years' licenses, ledgers, permits. Her hand trembled slightly as she lit a match, shielding the flame with her palm. The light trembled over the names carved in ink, lives folded into neat handwriting. She found it after a few minutes. Pascal Rourke, trading license, freight and livestock, and beneath, the words that made her breath catch, expired, location transferred, winding fork. The match burned low. She dropped it into the ashtray, her pulse thudding in her ears. She traced the words again, just to be sure. Winding fork, 2 days' ride north, the place where her sister's trail had gone cold. Then a floorboard creaked. She froze. The room fell into black again, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give her away. Another sound, boots against wood, slow and steady. The door eased open, letting in a sliver of moonlight. "Didn't figure you'd wait till morning," Amos said softly. Nora turned, the shadows catching the edge of her face. He stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, coat unbuttoned, his eyes more tired than angry. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said. He shook his head. "You didn't." The silence between them stretched thin. Then he stepped closer, slow, deliberate, until the light touched his face. "You found something," he said. Her throat tightened. Winding fork. "That's where he is." Amos nodded once, eyes fixed on the open book in front of her. She waited for the scolding, the words about safety, about letting the past stay buried, but they didn't come. Instead, he sighed, long and quiet. "Last time," he said, voice low, "I came too late. My sister. She was gone before I even found the tracks." She looked up. His voice had changed rougher, deeper somehow, carrying the ache of something old. He met her eyes. "This time, I ain't staying behind." The words sank into her like warmth after cold. Not a command, not permission, a promise. They stood there for a long moment, neither speaking. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the smell of rain and horses. The lantern flickered once, shadows dancing over the records like ghosts whispering through time. Finally, Amos took the ledger from her hands and closed it. "Let's go before the sun catches us," he said. She hesitated. "You sure?" He gave a small, crooked smile. "No, but I'm coming anyway." They left through the side door, his boots muffled against the dirt, her steps light beside his. The horse snorted softly as they approached, shaking rain from its mane. As Amos adjusted the saddle, she glanced back toward the dark outline of the courthouse. So many stories lived inside those walls, some honest, some cruel. Hers had been one of the cruel ones, but maybe not anymore. When she swung up into the saddle, the first light of dawn was beginning to edge the horizon, soft and gray. The kind of light that makes you believe maybe morning really can start over. They rode north. The road narrowed between the hills, the world around them waking slow. Neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was something different now, like breath shared between two people who didn't need words to understand. At one bend in the trail, she looked over at him, his face lined by years and weather. She wanted to say thank you, but it wasn't gratitude she felt, it was trust. And trust had no language she knew how to speak. He caught her looking and gave a small nod. The kind that meant I know. The sky ahead was brightening, streaked with pale pink. Somewhere in that light, the name Winding Fork waited like an echo of unfinished things. She tightened her grip on the reins, heart steady, eyes forward. Behind them, Ash Creek was already fading into shadow. Ahead lay the road, red and long, smelling faintly of rain and iron. The wildflower on her lapel trembled with each gust of wind, but didn't fall. And when Amos glanced her way one last time, she met his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't look away. The road to Winding Fork had grown colder. Nights came quicker now, and the stars cut sharper against the sky. By dusk, the valley fell into the deep blue silence where even the horses' breathing sounded loud. They'd made camp beside a dry creek bed, the fire crackling low between them. Amos had gone quiet hours ago, eyes fixed on the flames, the weight of memory sitting heavy in his shoulders. Nora watched him from across the fire, the light flickering over his face. She wondered what ghosts he saw in that firelight. She had her own, too many to name. She took out her small notebook, the one she always kept close. The edges were worn, the pages soft from her hands. For days, she'd been carrying a truth like a splinter under the skin, small, but impossible to forget. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the night. Amos looked up once, his eyes meeting hers, then turned back to the flames. He didn't ask what she was writing. He never did. Her pencil moved slow. The words came halting, uneven, like steps across thin ice. There was a girl. She wrote, her name was Clara. I led her to them. I told her it was safe. They took her instead of my sister. I thought I could live with it, but I can't. Her hand stopped shaking only when she ran out of words. She closed the notebook, holding it against her chest for a long time, the weight of it no lighter. The wind carried the smell of sage and ash. Somewhere far off, a coyote called lonely, searching. She pressed her eyes shut. Sleep didn't come easy that night. When she woke, dawn had only begun to touch the hills. Amos was already up, coffee brewing, the fire stoked. He sat with the ledger from the town beside him, his thumb marking a page. Her notebook lay open on the ground between them. For a moment, her breath caught. He'd read it. She could tell from the way his hand rested on it, not careless, but gentle, like something that could break if held wrong. He didn't speak right away, just poured her a tin cup of coffee, slid it across the dirt. Didn't mean to pry, he said quietly. Wind must have opened it. Nora tried to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. Finally, she managed, "You read it." He nodded once. Silence hung heavy between them. The kind that isn't empty, it's waiting. Then he said, "Clara." Her name in his mouth sounded softer. Somehow, less like a wound and more like a prayer. "I knew a girl like that once," Amos said. Not her name, but her kind. She thought saving one person meant losing another. "I reckon she was wrong." Nora looked at him, eyes stinging. "You don't understand." "I do," he said simply. "You did what you thought would keep your sister alive. And another girl died for it," she whispered. Amos's gaze held hers, steady, calm, unflinching. "I don't believe in measuring sins like weights on a scale," he said. "I believe in what we do next." The words landed quiet but heavy, like a hand laid gently on an open wound. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "You don't know what that feels like." He smiled, faintly. "Don't I?" He looked back at the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to climb. "Once, I left a man behind," he said. "My brother. We were in the mines down in Abilene. I went for help, came back too late." He took a breath, slow and deep. "I've been trying to do better ever since. Not to erase it, just to keep it from happening again." The fire cracked softly. Nora stared into it, her hands trembling in her lap. His story didn't erase hers, but it sat beside it, like two stones in the same river, worn by the same current. Finally, he turned toward her. "I don't believe in the past," he said. "I believe in what we choose today. He reached down, picked up the notebook, and placed it gently back in her hands. Grace ain't for the ones who earned it, Nora. It's for the ones who need it. The tears came before she could stop them. Not loud, not heavy, just quiet like rain that had waited too long to fall. Amos didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. He just sat there, letting her cry in peace, the fire between them steady and warm. After a while, she spoke again, her voice raw. "I wish I could take it back." He shook his head. "Don't. The only thing worth changing is what comes next." A long silence followed. Birds began to stir in the trees above, the first hints of morning light catching on their wings. Nora wiped her face with her sleeve and looked down at the notebook. The pages had wrinkled from her tears. She opened it and wrote a single line beneath her confession. "I am not forgiven because I deserve it, but because someone decided I could be." When she looked up, Amos was packing the saddle, movements slow, deliberate. He caught her watching and said, "We'll reach Winding Fork by nightfall if we keep pace." She nodded, voice too small to answer. Before mounting, he paused, turned toward her once more. "Clara," he said softly, "if she was here now, I think she'd rather see you live right than die. Sorry." Nora closed her eyes. The morning breeze lifted her hair, carrying the scent of dust and pine. For the first time in a long while, the weight on her chest didn't feel like punishment. It felt like memory, softened by mercy. As they rode north again, the trail wound through a valley of tall grass, golden under the rising sun. The light caught on her face, warm and clean, and she let it. The pages of her notebook pressed against her heart, with each breath no longer a record of shame, but of survival. Amos rode ahead, the brim of his hat cutting the sun from his eyes. She watched him for a while, then urged her horse closer until they moved side by side. No words, just the quiet rhythm of hooves, the whisper of wind through the grass, and the unspoken promise that maybe, just maybe, Grace had found them both. The wind had teeth that evening, cold, sharp, and restless. It came down off the ridge like a warning, rattling the loose boards of the barn and carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The sky hung heavy with it. Even the horses seemed uneasy, snorting and stamping as if they, too, could sense what was coming. Nora stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug gone lukewarm. The day had been quiet, too quiet. No riders on the distant road, no smoke from the nearby valley, just silence, thick as waiting. Amos was fixing the hinge on the corral gate when he looked up, eyes narrowing toward the hills. He didn't say a word, but she saw it in the way his hand went to the small of his back, fingers brushing the handle of his revolver. Then she heard it too. Hooves. Faint at first, then many. The rhythm wasn't friendly. She set her mug down, the sound of porcelain on wood lost under the growing thunder of horses. Dust rose on the horizon. 5, maybe 6 riders coming fast, the sun catching the glint of rifles slung across their saddles. And at the front of them, a man she knew, Jude Carver. His voice reached them before his shape did, rough and too familiar. "McKenna, you've been keeping what ain't yours." Nora's blood ran cold. She stepped back, one hand gripping the porch rail. Amos didn't flinch. He wiped his hands on a rag, hung it on the post, and called out, calm as if greeting a customer, "Evenin', Carver. Wind's got a mean bite tonight. What brings you down off your hill?" Carver reined in his horse, the animal's breath steaming in the cooling air. He grinned, the kind that showed too many teeth. "You know damn well, McKenna, heard you got a woman here, one that belongs to us." Amos's eyes didn't move from his. "Belongs," Carver spat into the dirt. "Yeah, that one you picked up in Ash Creek. She's got debts, you might say." The men behind him laughed low, ugly sounds. Nora could feel their eyes on her even from the porch. Her stomach turned. Amos stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the boards creaking under his boots. "She's free," he said. "Ain't no man owns her. Not anymore." Carver's grin faded. "You think you can wash the dirt off a whore and make her clean? McKenna." You're dumber than I figured." The words hit like a whip, but Amos didn't rise to them. He just looked at her for a heartbeat, then back at Carver. "If you came here looking for trouble, you found it, but you'll leave empty-handed." The silence that followed was tight enough to snap. Then Carver nodded once to the men behind him. Rifles shifted. Amos's voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for her. "Can you ride?" Nora's throat was dry, but she nodded. "Try me." He moved fast after that, untying the horses, checking his pistol, scanning the ground like a man who knew every inch of it. But the riders were quicker. By the time the second horse was free, one of Carver's men had flanked the barn, cutting off the back path. Gunfire cracked once, the sound tearing through the quiet like a shout. The horses screamed, rearing. Nora ducked instinctively, heart pounding. "Go!" Amos yelled, but she hesitated, looking back. That hesitation cost them. Two of the men closed in. She swung the butt of her rifle hard, catching one across the jaw. The other grabbed her arm, yanking her from the saddle. The ground hit her shoulder hard enough to take the breath from her chest. She fought, kicking, clawing, teeth bared. They cursed, tried to hold her still. One laughed, breath hot against her ear. Still wild. "Huh, Carver'll like that." She bit his hand until she tasted blood. He roared, backhanding her. The world blurred. Amos shouted her name somewhere behind her, the sound swallowed by gunfire. Then everything went black. When she came to, the world was moving. The smell of horses, sweat, and rain filled her nose. Her wrists were tied, her face pressed against coarse fabric, jostled by the rhythm of hooves. She didn't need to ask where they were taking her. Copper Bend. The name alone made her stomach twist. She counted the steps in her head, timed her breath with the horse's stride. The ropes were tight, but she tested them anyway. Small movements hidden by the sway. If she couldn't get free, she could at least slow them down. One of the men rode close, leering. "Ain't no one coming for you, girl." She said nothing, but inside, she thought of Amos the way he'd looked at her before the first shot rang out. Not fear, not panic, just promise. The camp came into view near midnight, a cluster of tents under the rock face, the firelight painting the canyon walls red and cruel. They dragged her down, shoving her toward the biggest tent. Jude Carver waited inside, sitting like a king among thieves, his boots propped on a crate. He smiled when he saw her. "Well, if it ain't my runaway." She spat blood onto the ground. "You'll never own me again." He laughed a deep, lazy sound. "Sweetheart, the world don't care what you think you own." He leaned forward, eyes cold. "But it sure as hell knows who's in charge." Her jaw tightened. She said nothing, not even when he struck her. The pain was sharp, but the silence was sharper. Outside, the night deepened. A storm gathered over the hills, lightning flickering behind the clouds like the flash of hidden anger. She sat bound in the corner, breathing slow, watching the ropes, the guard by the flap, the shadows moving outside. Every sound mattered now. Every second counted. She whispered to herself, just loud enough for her own ears. "Hold on, he's coming." And somewhere out there, through wind and rain and miles of black road, Amos McKenna rode through the storm. The night itself seemed to move aside for him. Because there are some promises that don't break, no matter how dark the trail gets. The night smelled of gun oil and rain. The wind had changed, sliding down from the north, colder now, like the breath before a storm. Ash Creek was awake, lanterns burned in windows, men saddling their horses in the half-dark. Amos stood in the street, coat buttoned, hat low, revolver at his hip. No one asked him if he was sure. They could see it in his face. He'd gone to the blacksmith shop first, gathered what he needed: extra rounds, a length of rope, kerosene. Then he knocked on doors, quiet but certain, calling in every man who still remembered what it felt like to stand for something. By the time the clock struck 9, a dozen riders waited at the edge of town. "Copper Bend," Amos said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. They all knew what waited there. The men nodded, grim and silent. Some had daughters, Some had sisters, and one man, Amos, had something worth riding into hell for. They set out under a sky split by lightning. The rain hadn't fallen yet, but the thunder rolled across the plain like the sound of hooves from another world. Copper Bend came into view just before midnight, a scar of tents and smoke huddled between the red rocks. Firelight flickered against the canyon walls, painting everything the color of blood. From her place inside the main tent, Nora heard them before she saw them, the faint, uneven echo of hooves moving fast. She'd been counting the minutes since Carver left to check the perimeter. Her wrists burned where the rope cut into her skin. When the first shot rang out, it didn't feel real. It was a dry crack that split the air, and then chaos followed. Men shouted, horses screamed, gunfire lit up the night like flashes of lightning. She rolled onto her side, kicked the guard's knee as he turned, and he fell, cursing. By the time he reached for his rifle, she was already moving. The rope slipped from her wrist. She'd loosened them hours ago, one breath at a time. Outside, the camp was alive with fire and noise. Amos was there. She could feel it before she saw him. Smoke stung her eyes as she crawled between tents, grabbing a discarded pistol. The ground shook under the pounding of boots. One man came running past. She fired once. He dropped. Then she saw him through the smoke. Amos, crouched behind a wagon, reloading, his face streaked with dust and sweat. Something in her chest broke loose. He looked up just as a shot came from the ridge. She didn't think. She moved. The world narrowed to a single sound, the crack of a rifle. Then silence. The bullet found her first. A hot, sudden pain tore through her shoulder, spinning her sideways into the dirt. Amos turned at the sound, saw her fall. He was at her side before the echo faded, hands trembling as he pressed against the wound. Nora, hey, stay with me. She tried to breathe, but the air came shallow. His face blurred in the firelight, too close, too bright. He pulled her up against his chest, his voice shaking now. Talk to me, Nora, please. Her lips curved in the faintest smile. I told you you'd regret choosing me. Don't, he said, his voice breaking. Don't you do that. She reached for his hand, her fingers slick with her own blood. You waited, she whispered. All that time. Now I know why. Why he asked, his thumb brushing her cheek. So I'd be strong enough to choose you back. Her words came soft, almost lost under the thunder. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead to hers. I'll always come for you, he said. Every time, no matter how far. The firelight flickered against them, two shapes in the storm, bound by something deeper than the past, stronger than pain. Behind them, the fight raged on, men shouting, rifles cracking, sparks flying as bullets hit stone. But for a moment, all that fell away. All Amos saw was her face pale, fierce, alive. He lifted her carefully, his arms steady despite the tremor in his hands. We're going home, he said. She tried to laugh, but it came out a breath instead. Home, she whispered. That's new. He carried her through the smoke and chaos, the storm breaking overhead at last. Rain fell hard and sudden, washing the blood from his hands, the fire from the tents, the past from the air. Men followed him, those from Ash Creek. Voices raised above the storm, driving Carver's gang back into the canyon. Some fell, some didn't rise again. But by dawn, Copper Bend was silent. When the sun broke through, the camp was nothing but wet ashes and twisted canvas. Amos knelt beside a stream, his coat wrapped around her, her breath shallow but still there. The light touched her face, pale gold against the gray morning. She opened her eyes once more, looked at him, and whispered, You came? He nodded, voice rough. Always. For a while, they just sat there, the stream running clear beside them, the world strangely calm after all the noise. Somewhere up the hill, the men were counting the lost, burying what was left. But down by the water, it was only them two people who'd both run out of places to hide. Nora's hand found his. Amos? Yeah, if I don't. He stopped her with a shake of his head. Don't. Then softer. You will. She closed her eyes, leaned her head against his chest. The sound of his heartbeat was steady, slow. Sure, like the earth itself hadn't given up yet. For the first time in a long while, she believed it might not. The rain eased, the sky began to clear. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark sang, its voice fragile and bright in the new light. Amos looked down at her, his thumb tracing the dirt from her brow. You're safe, he said, though it was mostly to himself. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. No, Amos, I'm seen. And that, more than anything, broke him. Because she was right. He gathered her close, eyes closing, breath deep with the scent of rain and smoke and everything that had ever mattered. The world around them was still broken, still raw, still full of ghosts, but in that one quiet space, between thunder and sunrise, something had finally been mended. The snow melted slow that year. By mid-March, the earth around the McKenna range began to breathe again, soft and damp, the color of new beginnings. The fields that once held frost now shimmered faintly under morning light, the smell of wet soil mingling with pine and smoke from the kitchen stove. Nora woke early each day, though her shoulder still ached when the weather turned. She moved carefully, the way someone does after learning how easily a body can break. Outside, the horizon stretched wide, endless, as if the world had been remade overnight. She carried a tin pail of seeds to the back field, lupine, wild, hardy, the kind that grew on rocky slopes and refused to die. She knelt, pressing each seed into the dirt with her fingers. The soil clung to her skin, cool and honest. Each handful was a prayer, though she didn't call it that. The sound of a hammer came faint from the barn. Amos, fixing the roof again, though the wind had barely touched it. He worked like a man who found peace only in the rhythm of his hands. Sometimes he'd look up, see her bent over the field, and pause just long enough to catch his breath. He never said much about that night in Copper Bend. Neither did she. Some things, one survived, didn't need retelling. But sometimes, when the fire burned low, she'd glance at the scar along her shoulder and think of how the world could have ended and didn't. And Amos, sitting across from her, would notice the quiet shift in her gaze. He'd pour her tea, let the silence stretch. It was enough. The first lupine sprouted in late April, thin green shoots reaching for a sky that hadn't yet decided if it would snow again. She checked on them every morning, speaking softly under her breath, like the flowers might listen. It made Amos smile. He said the plants grew better when someone talked to them. She told him maybe that's all anyone ever needed, to be spoken to kindly, just once, and to believe it. That evening, as the light began to fade, Amos came from the barn carrying something small wrapped in an old rag. He stopped a few feet from her, hat in hand, the wind tugging gently at his coat. "Nora," he said. His voice still had that gravel tone, but there was warmth beneath it now, steady, quiet, like the earth itself. She turned toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. "What's that?" He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a wooden box, smooth and dark from his hands. Inside lay a silver ring, shaped simple but true, the metal faintly dulled by the forge smoke it came from. "I made it from the shoe of that old mare you saved," he said. "Figured it ought to mean something that lasts." He looked at her, eyes soft under the brim of his hat. "It's not to keep you, not to own you, just to walk beside you if that's what you want." The wind carried his words out across the plain, where they fell quiet among the grass. Nora looked down at the ring, then back at him. For a moment, she saw not the blacksmith, not the rancher, but the man who had waited, and kept waiting, until she was ready to be free. She took the ring, held it in her palm. The metal was cool, the edges rough where his file hadn't quite smoothed the forge marks. She liked that. It felt honest. "Amos," she said softly. Her voice trembled a little, but not from fear. She slipped the ring onto her finger. "This time," she said, "I'm not running. I'm choosing to stay." He didn't speak, he just nodded once, slow, like a man who finally understood something he'd been hoping to believe. The last light of day caught the silver in her hand, flashing briefly before fading into dusk. They stood there a long while, saying nothing, just the wind moving through the grass, the faint hum of the barn door, the rhythm of two breaths finding the same pace. When the stars came out, he lit the lantern on the porch. She set 2 chairs near the steps, one for him, one for her. The smell of rain drifted again soft this time, almost kind. In the distance, a coyote called. Then the land went quiet once more. Days blurred into weeks. The field behind the house turned blue and violet with the bloom. Lupines swayed in the wind like small fires, thousands of them, dancing under the vast Colorado sky. When Nora walked through them, her skirt brushed against the petals, leaving trails of color and scent behind her. She'd pause sometimes, close her eyes, and let the wind lift her hair. There was no fear in that stillness anymore, only breath, inside the house. Her old notebook sat on the table. The pages filled edge to edge with words she no longer needed to hide. Some of them were dark, heavy as stone, but near the back, on a clean page, a single line stood alone. Mercy isn't what saves us, it's what lets us start again. She didn't remember writing it. Maybe she hadn't meant to, but it was true all the same. Amos would sometimes read those pages in the quiet mornings when she wasn't looking, then close the book and rest his hand on it for a long moment, not to claim it, just to honor what it had carried. Spring deepened, birds returned, the air filled with the hum of new life, the slow rebuilding of a world that had almost been lost. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, Nora stepped outside with her coffee and stood among the lupine. Dew clung to the petals, tiny sparks of light catching in her hair. She could hear Amos moving somewhere behind her, the scrape of a chair, the whistle he always carried under his breath. She smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because it was real, the kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from surviving. She bent down, ran her hand through the flowers, and whispered, "Thank you." She wasn't sure who she said it to: the earth, the sky, the man inside, or the girl she used to be. Maybe all of them. She straightened, turned toward the porch, and saw Amos watching her. A quiet smile in his eyes. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. The wind rose once more, sweeping through the field, carrying the scent of lupine across the range. It brushed against their faces, gentle and cool, as if the land itself exhaled. They stood there a while longer, no promises, no vows. Just 2 souls who had finally stopped running, breathing in the same spring air. And when the moment passed, the world went on turning, slow, patient, kind. In the quiet rhythm of Nora and Amos's story lies a truth as old as the land itself, that healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, like spring thawing the last snow, asking only that we stay, breathe, and let time do its work. The tale reminds us that kindness spoken softly can change the course of a life, that mercy is not weakness, but courage, the courage to see someone's pain and not turn away. For those who've carried long years of regret or loneliness, this story whispers that it's never too late to begin again. We can't rewrite the past, but we can choose what grows from it. Like Nora planting lupine in the soil once scarred by storms, we, too, can plant something gentle where sorrow once lived. Love, in its truest form, asks for nothing but presence to walk beside, not to possess. And sometimes, the greatest redemption is simply to be seen, fully and without judgment, after years of hiding. So, when the world feels heavy, remember this: mercy, patience, and quiet understanding can still turn the dust of yesterday into something living, something worth keeping. Thank you, friends, for riding with us through this story, for every quiet minute you spent listening, feeling, and remembering what it means to be human. If Nora and Amos's journey touched something in your heart, let it travel a little farther. Give this story a like, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll be here when the next tale from the Old West flickers back to life. Until then, keep the fire warm, keep the faith gentle, and we'll meet again, out where the wind still carries the sound of old stories.